I like to think of auto DevOps in very simple terms as having three parts. And sometimes with all the different branding aspects to it and all the history of it and all the different things that it does, sometimes it can get lost and confusing. And I like to boil it down to these three. First off, it does build and test, classic CD. And for that, it actually implements a mechanism to detect the type of project and apply the correct build and test jobs to that project. We generally do not recommend that technically sophisticated customers bother with that. You already have build and test scripts, or you already know what test frameworks apply to the projects you're working on, and they're easy enough to implement. It's usually one line of a script in a job, and so usually that's just a simple thing to throw together. And so really auto DevOps, it's sort of fun to demo how it can figure out what your project is and build it, but that's really outside of the scope of what's interesting to you. The second thing it does is security scanning. Really, although auto DevOps itself does include all the scanning jobs, really we recommend that you control those through scan execution policies, and that drives directly to the vulnerability management that comes with GitLab. So although auto DevOps does include security scanning, it's really kind of separate from what we're talking about when we talk about auto DevOps. The part that I think is most important and most interesting to you all is the cloud native deployment aspect of it, the auto deploy, as we call it, which deploys not only to staging and production environments, so kind of permanent environments that are within a Kubernetes cluster, but also to review apps, those ephemeral apps that you can use to look at individual feature branches and changes that are being made before they get merged in. And of course, Kubernetes being a cluster orchestration system makes it really easy to spin up and down whole environments to do that. So we're going to talk about auto deploy, cloud native deployment here, because build and test, and not so interesting, and security scanning is really a different topic in a sense. So for that cloud native deployment, it makes a lot of assumptions. There's a reason it's called auto. There's a reason we have a checkbox to turn it on, which is that it kind of is built for the simplest case. But I'm going to get to where we customize it, and that's where it gets interesting. So some of those assumptions. The first assumption is that the project in question is a web app or API. This might seem obvious, but some people say, hey, can I use auto DevOps to distribute a mobile app or to embed firmware? And yeah, chances are, it's really about cloud native. It's really about web-based applications. You could probably do things that aren't exactly web-based, but really that's the main focus. The second thing is that it is built for PostgreSQL as the database. So it has built-in support for PostgreSQL running in the cluster using CSI, Container Storage Interface, that's it, within Kubernetes to allocate volumes for PostgreSQL. So it's not really built around deploying to other cloud services such as RDS within Amazon, for example. It's really built around deploying to PostgreSQL within the cluster. Now, in the case of review apps, that's awesome because you don't necessarily want to spin up a whole RDS database for a review app every time you have a new feature branch. But in the case of production world, you're probably going to go with those services that are built in with AWS. That's sort of outside the scope of what auto deploy is built for, but we can customize it, which I'll get to. It's designed for a single cluster. There's sort of a built-in assumption that you're in one cluster. And in fact, there's an assumption that you're within one namespace or have fairly simple rules around which namespace applies to which jobs, deployment jobs. It makes the assumption of Nginx for ingress and Let's Encrypt for certificates. So that's kind of built into the scripts that come with auto deploy. We can work around it. And finally, it's sort of, I said, only app and database. If your application has other services that it requires, so maybe it requires Redis or an email service or even a storage, object storage, it's not really, the auto DevOps as it's built isn't really built around deploying to the whole set of services. The assumption is you're going to have some kind of GitOps component to do that. It's really around the rapid deployment of an app and database changes to using those review apps. And so once again, all of the things on here are assumptions if you want to just use the checkbox or use the one-liner and turn on auto DevOps, but they can all be customized. So at a high level, how do you customize? Cloud native deployment in auto DevOps, which we call auto deploy. is really there are three pieces to it. Okay, the first piece is there is a job, the auto deployed job. It is actually a job and it is actually public, and I've got the link bookmarked, excuse me. And so you can see the job. That job basically is a wrapper around a set of scripts that are in a job image that's also public, that are actually mostly bash scripts that perform Helm operations. And so Helm install commands with lots of options and things. And so then there are also Helm charts that actually perform the deployment to the cluster. All of this can be modified, all of it can be overridden in different ways, and various settings can be applied depending on what kind of customization you want to do to it. So one of the things I've been tinkering with over the past couple of weeks is kind of looking at what are some of the things, sort of simple examples of that customization that we can use as a starting point. Because really, when you're customizing, really Auto DevOps is providing an example and sort of a starting point for how you can do that customization and kind of leverage some of the best practices from GitLab, but still sort of tweak it and modify it to the particular needs of your organization. So my example, everybody's got one, is I love DevOps, a web app that does nothing. Now, secret thing here, a lot of our demos of Auto DevOps don't actually include or exercise the database component. This app does. Took some jumping through hoops to get this to work. The volume setup working correctly on AWS. But actually, this is actually a database driven application here that I've deployed using auto deploy to a Kubernetes cluster on EKS. Now, how did I do it? You can, in theory, check a checkbox, and that says turn on auto DevOps. That's the auto part, yeah. And in reality, you're going to have a job, you're going to have a pipeline that includes the auto DevOps template, and then probably overrides some values. So in this case, we're actually overriding some variables for details around how the database is set up, the initialization of the database. There's all kinds of opportunities to override here. And I've tinkered with a lot of those. We know those really well. You can find them out by reading the code. Sort of some examples of that here. And then this is deploying to my domain. And some of these variables are also set in the project settings, but in this case, I set most of them here in the actual CI config. And then there's another place where customization happens besides setting values and overriding jobs, and that is you can actually override Helm chart values directly within your project. So this is in the same project. I have auto deploy values, and I'm actually overriding, in this case, the port that's used for the readiness probe and for the service itself. So, and this is a great example of how Nginx is assumed, because our Helm chart will update Nginx with the proxy to point to the port of your app. And so if we're using one of the AWS services for that, then we would need to do the equivalent thing with that service.